The Vrethkai Grand Court had processed 10,000 diplomatic audiences in its recorded history. Ambassadors from species that breathed methane, species that communicated exclusively through bioluminescent pulse, species whose concept of gravity was philosophical rather than physical. All of them had passed through the obsidian archways of the Dominion Central Chamber. The court had seen fear weaponized, pride performed, and submission so elaborate it bordered on art. What it had never seen was a human guard. The Earth diplomatic mission arrived without fanfare, a detail that itself generated controversy. The Vrethkai intelligence apparatus had spent 8 months preparing for this first contact between their Dominion and the species designated H7 in the Galactic Registry, informally called humans in their own languages. The preparation involved psychological profiles built from intercepted transmissions, behavioral models derived from partial observation of human colonial outposts at the edge of the Kepler corridor, and 17 competing threat assessments that ranged from negligible to systemically disruptive. What none of the assessments had adequately modeled was what Corporal Yadarko looked like standing at attention in an alien court. He was the Eastern Archway Guard. His counterpart, Sergeant Priya Mehta, held the Western Post. 2 humans, assigned to protect Ambassador Renata Vasquez and her small delegation of 4 during the opening session of what the Dominion hoped would be a straightforward territorial negotiation. The humans occupied a stellar region the Dominion wanted access to. The humans had made no aggressive moves, but they had also demonstrated, quietly through a pattern of actions rather than any declaration, that they intended to remain where they were. This was the first formal meeting between species. It was supposed to be ceremonial. It was supposed to establish hierarchies of respect, communicate the Dominion's scope of power, and gently impress upon the human delegation the reality of their position. Newcomers on the galactic stage and proven, negotiating from a position of significant strategic disadvantage. Queen Sarathuval had performed this calibration hundreds of times. She was not cruel. She simply understood that clarity about power dynamics, established early, prevented the kind of miscommunication that led to conflict. It was, in her view, a kindness. She noticed Corporal Darko 40 minutes into the opening ceremony. It was the stillness that caught her attention first, not as an absence of movement, but as something qualitatively different from inactivity. The Mukai honor guards at the northern wall were stationary, but they were visibly managing their stillness, breathing exercises cycling through their gill structures, eyes darting in micropatterns that betrayed the cognitive work of sustained attention. The Threlian ceremonial soldiers near the ambassador's box had adopted formal postures, but their weight shifted subtly every few minutes, a necessary accommodation for a species whose circulatory system required periodic postural recalibration. The human did not shift. He did not cycle. His eyes were fixed at a specific point in the middle distance, not unfocused, but rather precisely directed at a spatial coordinate that contained no particular object of interest, which meant he had selected that point deliberately. His breathing was slow and controlled enough that his chest movement was, from the Queen's distance, nearly imperceptible. He was not ignoring the ceremony. He was not bored. He was somewhere else, mentally, not disengaged but rather compressed into a state of sustained functional readiness that the Queen, despite her vast experience with sentient species, could not immediately categorize. She filed the observation and continued the ceremony. It was the Grand Chronicler who first formally noted the anomaly, whispering into the Queen's secondary auditory receptor during a transition between ritual phases. Majesty, the human guard at the Eastern Arch. He has not altered his postural configuration in 43 minutes. Our biological monitors at that range suggest his cortisol equivalents are within what the xenobiologists classify as baseline resting parameters. He is, by all physiological indicators, calm. Calm, the Queen repeated, not as a question. Calm, the chronicler confirmed, with a note of something that in a less disciplined member of court would have been described as unease. Queen Sarathuval understood why. Calm, in a novel and potentially threatening environment, was not a neutral data point. It was either evidence of profound ignorance, a possibility she did not discount, or evidence of something she found considerably more interesting. A being who had genuinely processed the situation and decided it did not require him to be anything other than what he already was. She made a decision that surprised her own court. Midway through the processional acknowledgement, a ritual moment that demanded the full physical and performative attention of every dignitary present, she rose from her throne and walked toward the Eastern Archway. The chamber went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with acoustics. 700 delegates watched their Queen cross the polished floor toward a human soldier who had not yet noticed her approach, or if he had, showed no visible indication of it. Her crest fanned as she moved, a subconscious display that she permitted because it was honest. She was genuinely curious and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She stopped 3 meters from Corporal Darko. He was looking at the same point in the middle distance. She stepped closer. 2 meters. 1 meter. Her sensory antennae extended, reading the microclimate around him. His skin temperature was normal. His heart rate, detectable through the slight movement at his jugular, was elevated perhaps 8% above what the xenobiological baseline suggested for a human at rest. 8%. In a room full of beings who could, in theory, end his life in seconds, the human soldier's heart was beating 8% faster than if he were sitting at home. She had seen Vrethkai honor guards break full ceremonial posture at the mere sound of her approach. She had watched experienced diplomats of a dozen species visibly recalibrate their breathing when she entered their field of vision. The human's heart rate ticked up 8%. His posture did not change. His eyes did not move. "Corporal," Ambassador Vasquez said quietly from across the chamber, a single word that contained what sounded like both a warning and an apology. The Queen held up a hand without turning around, a gesture she had rarely used, one that meant "I am not finished." She studied the man for another 10 seconds. Then she said in standard, "You know I am here." Pause. Then, without moving anything but his jaw, Corporal Darko said, "Yes, Your Grace." And another pause. Longer this time. When he answered, his voice was even, neither hostile nor deferential, calibrated in a way that struck the Queen as almost surgical in its precision. "And I'm on duty, Your Grace." Queen Sarathuval stood there for a moment longer. Then she returned to her throne, settled into it, and was quiet for the remaining 40 minutes of the opening ceremony. Afterward, when her Grand Chronicler asked what she had learned, she considered the question carefully. "That stillness," she said at last, "is not always the same thing as submission. I will need to revise several of my models." The debrief following the opening ceremony lasted 6 hours. This was unusual. Typically, post-session analysis ran 2 hours, long enough to extract behavioral data, update threat models and recalibrate the next day's negotiating posture. The additional 4 hours were, in the words of Chief Intelligence Analyst Vethoryuan, necessitated by a significant gap between predicted and observed human behavioral parameters. The gap, as Vethoryuan explained it to Queen Sarathuval's inner council, was not subtle. The Vrethkai's human behavioral model had been constructed over 8 months using every available data source. Intercepted civilian communications, commercial shipping manifests from the Kepler corridor, partial observation records from scout probes that had briefly penetrated human colonial space before being politely but firmly escorted out, and, most significantly, analysis of human military doctrine derived from documents that the humans themselves had published publicly in open archives. That last point had generated substantial debate within the intelligence apparatus. It seemed implausible that a species would publish its military doctrine openly. The prevailing theory was that the published materials were disinformation, strategic misdirection designed to create false predictive models and potential adversaries. This seemed like exactly the kind of thing an intelligence service would do. The alternative theory, that humans simply published their military doctrine because they believed in institutional transparency as a matter of principle, had been dismissed as too naive to take seriously. They were now re-evaluating that dismissal. Because every behavioral pattern displayed by the 2 human guards in the Grand Court matched, with high fidelity, what the open-source documents described as standard diplomatic protection protocol. There were no surprises hidden beneath the surface. The humans had told the galaxy exactly how their security personnel were trained, what they were trained to do and why, and then their security personnel had done exactly that. The guard designated Darko, Vethoryuan said, pulling up the biometric data captured by the chamber's passive sensor array, maintained a cortisol-equivalent reading at 1.08 times baseline throughout the full 94-minute session, including the period during which Her Majesty conducted a direct proximity assessment. For reference, the average Vrethkai honor guard in a comparable proximity assessment scenario elevates to approximately 2.3 to 2.7 times baseline. The Threlian ceremonial soldiers in the chamber peaked at 3.1 during Her Majesty's approach to the Eastern Arch. They were afraid, the Queen said. She was not looking at the data. She was looking at the wall. They registered significant stress responses, yes, Majesty. The human registered almost none. Our initial assessment was instrument error. We ran 3 calibration checks. The instruments are functioning correctly. Councillor Drethuven, who oversaw military affairs, leaned forward. Explain the mechanism. Is this a physiological trait? Some form of stress suppression that is unique to the human species? Vethoryuan paused. This was, he had come to understand over the previous 6 hours, the most significant question, and he did not have a fully satisfying answer. Partially, he said. The human endocrine system does appear to have somewhat different regulation characteristics than most species we have profiled. But the bulk of what we observed is not physiological. It is behavioral. It is, based on the doctrine documents and what we can reconstruct from training records in their published military archives, the result of a specific and deliberate training methodology. He brought up the relevant section of the human military document on the display. It was not, he had noted with some discomfort, classified. It appeared to be a publicly available training manual. The humans call it stress inoculation, he said. The systematic and progressive exposure of trainees to stressors of increasing magnitude, in controlled conditions, until the physiological stress response becomes, their word, manageable. Not eliminated. Manage. The guard Darko's heart rate was elevated 8% during proximity assessment. He was not calm in the way a being is calm in an unthreatening environment. He was calm in the way a being is calm who has spent years practicing being calm in threatening environments. The council was quiet. There is a second component, Vethoryuan continued. Their training doctrine places significant emphasis on what they term mission focus, the cognitive practice of reducing the experienced complexity of a situation to the task immediately at hand. A guard is not, in their framework, a being in a room full of potential threats assessing survival odds. A guard is a being with a post to hold. The psychological simplification is deliberate. It is trained. And it is, our analysts believe, a significant part of what produces the behavioral pattern we observed. Counselor Drethuvan sat back slowly. So they are not fearless. No, Vethoryuan said. They are trained to act as though fear has already been accounted for and set aside. The distinction is operationally significant. Queen Sarathuval spoke without turning from the wall. What else did we miss? Vethoryuan looked at his notes. There was quite a lot more. The guards had communicated with each other twice during the session, using a system the sensor array had only partially captured. Not a radio frequency communication, not a gesture-based code visible to casual observation, but a micro-expression pattern that the human military called nonverbal confirmation protocol. It was, the analysts had determined, essentially a method of transmitting status updates using facial movements subtle enough to be invisible to most species' perceptual systems. The Vrethkai sensor array had only captured it because the array was calibrated for exactly this kind of microsignal. And even then the analysts had initially flagged it as instrument noise before a junior analyst had looked more carefully. The humans had been talking to each other the entire session. No one in the chamber had known. The second guard, Meta, made 14 status transmissions to Darko over the 94 minutes, Vethoryuan said. We have been able to reconstruct the meaning of 11 of them from their published doctrine. They were routine. Door status, crowd density, ambient threat assessment, one transmission that appears to have been a notation that Her Majesty was approaching the Eastern Arch approximately 12 seconds before Her Majesty was aware she had decided to approach the Eastern Arch. The Queen turned from the wall. She anticipated my movement. She observed the micro-behavioral precursors of your decision to move and transmitted a warning to her partner, Vethoryuan said carefully. Whether that constitutes anticipation is a philosophical question. What it represents operationally is a two-person security team that was functioning as a coordinated unit with a reaction latency our analysts estimate at somewhere between 8 and 15 seconds ahead of the observable action. They were watching us watch them, Drethuvan said. They were watching everything, Vethoryuan said. That is, according to their published doctrine, precisely what they are trained to do. The council meeting continued for another 2 hours. By the end of it, Vethoryuan had revised the human threat assessment upward. Not because the humans had done anything threatening but because, threatening, had turned out to be the wrong analytical framework. The humans, as best the intelligence apparatus could determine, were not trying to threaten anyone. They were simply doing what they were trained to do, openly, transparently, without concealment. That was, in its own way, the most unsettling finding of all. A species that had nothing to hide, because it had already decided that what it was capable of was sufficient. That was a different kind of power than the court had encountered before. Sergeant Priya Mehta was eating a protein bar in the corridor outside the delegation's assigned quarters when the Grand Chronicler found her. This was not how diplomatic engagements typically began. The Grand Chronicler, a being whose function was roughly analogous to a combination of historian, protocol officer and institutional memory, had, in the course of a career spanning 47 years, never initiated an informal conversation with a security attaché before a session. Security personnel were logistical considerations, not interlocutors. But the Queen had asked specific questions that morning, and the chronicler had been sent to get specific answers. Sergeant Meta looked up from her protein bar without apparent surprise. She was a compact woman in her mid-30s, with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness, even at rest, even chewing, that the chronicler had now learned to identify as characteristic of the human security detail rather than characteristic of individuals. "Sergeant Meta," the chronicler said in standard. "I apologize for the informality. I have some questions if you have time." "I have 20 minutes, Meta said. "Session starts at the third bell. I will be efficient." The chronicler settled into the posture that among Vrethkai indicated a non-hierarchical exchange, a small but deliberate gesture of respect. Her Majesty was curious about several things she observed yesterday. "I have been asked to seek clarification." Meta took another bite of her protein bar. "Ask." The stillness, the physiological composure. "We observed, with passive instruments, not invasive monitoring, I want to be clear, stress indicators that were substantially lower than we expected given the environmental conditions. Our behavioral models suggested a much higher threat response profile." "Your behavioral models were probably built on species that aren't trained the way we are," Meta said. It was not dismissive, it was matter-of-fact, the tone of someone describing a straightforward technical difference. "That is our current assessment, yes. Can you describe the training?" Meta considered this. "I'll give you the version that's already in our public doctrine archives, because that's the version I'm authorized to discuss. The core concept is that your stress response is a biological system, and biological systems can be recalibrated through repeated exposure. You put soldiers in uncomfortable situations, progressively more uncomfortable over a long enough period, and the definition of comfortable shifts. What feels threatening to an untrained person eventually registers as elevated but manageable. And you begin this training, when? For Yaw and me, formal selection started at 22. We both had prior service before the diplomatic detail, so the baseline was already shifted. But it's not just the training." She paused, seeming to consider how to phrase the next part. "It's the commitment that happens before you walk in the door. You make a decision about what you're going to do in a given situation before the situation happens. When the situation arrives, you've already processed the hard part. You're just executing." The chronicler found this genuinely difficult to fully absorb. "You predecide your response to threat?" "Not to every specific threat. To the category. I decided a long time ago that if something alarming happens while I'm on post, I'm going to do my job. Not panic. Not run the math on survival odds. Do my job. That decision's been made. It's not something I'm figuring out in the moment. But the calculus changes depending on the threat's magnitude." Meta shook her head slightly. "That's where I think the model breaks down. The decision isn't about the threat's magnitude. It's about what I'm here to do. If the building is falling down, I'm still moving the ambassador to the exit point. The building falling down is just a different set of obstacles between me and completing that task." The chronicler sat with this for a moment. In 47 years, the closest analogy it could locate in its memory was the behavior of a particular class of Vrethkai monastic scholars who had, through decades of philosophical practice, achieved a state of detachment from self-preservative impulse. But those individuals had achieved that state as a spiritual end in itself. They had renounced the world. This human had not renounced anything. She was eating a protein bar and talking about logistics. "Her Majesty asked a second question," the chronicler said. "About the communication she observed between yourself and Corporal Darko." Meta's expression did not change, but something in it became slightly more precise. A micro-adjustment that the chronicler was now, after the previous day's analysis briefings, alert to. "We were doing our job," Meta said. "You communicated 14 times during the session using a sub-observable signaling system." 11, Meta said. "You missed 3. Pause. Sorry? That was probably unhelpful." The chronicler made a note. "The Queen would like to understand, was this signaling system designed specifically for diplomatic contexts? It appears to exploit gaps in most species' perceptual resolution. It's standard protocol for environments where radio communication might be politically sensitive and overt gesture communication might be misread as threat signaling," Meta said. "It's in the open-source doctrine under Diplomatic Protection Addenda, Chapter 7. The chronicler had, at this point, read Chapter 7. It had. It was there, exactly as described, available to anyone with a Galactic Registry Information Access account, which was to say anyone. Why? The chronicler asked, and it was a genuine question from an entity that had processed diplomatic intelligence for nearly 5 decades. Does your species publish this? Meta finished her protein bar, folded the wrapper with precise movements, and placed it in a pocket. She seemed to find the question genuinely interesting. Because the alternative is that our negotiating partners don't know what we're doing and get scared by it, she said. Scared partners make bad decisions. We'd rather you know we're going to do this, know why we're doing it, and be able to decide how you feel about it from an informed position. We're not trying to be mysterious. We're trying to get a treaty signed. The chronicler went back to the Queen with its notes. Queen Sarathuval read them twice. Then she called for the chief treaty negotiator and told him to offer the humans a longer session time the following day. Are we concerned about their capabilities? The negotiator asked. I am not concerned, the Queen said. I am interested. There is a difference. She set the notes down. A species that publishes its methods because it believes transparency produces better outcomes? That is a species that has thought carefully about how the world works. I would like to understand how they think. Pause. And I would like to sign a treaty with them before someone who hasn't thought carefully does something foolish that we all regret. On the third day, Ambassador Renata Vasquez made a decision that her diplomatic corps would spend the next decade debating in academic papers and training seminars. She asked to reduce her security detail. Not eliminate it. She was not reckless. But she had read the same intelligence summaries the Vrethkai were generating about her team, partially because the Vrethkai, in a move that surprised almost everyone who heard about it later, had shared them. Queen Sarathuval had sent a copy of Vethoryuan's behavioral analysis to the human delegation's quarters the previous evening, attached to a brief note that said, in standard, *, we thought you should know what we found. We believe you will find it accurate. We would welcome your corrections if we have misunderstood anything. *. The humans had, in fact, found it accurate. They had provided 2 corrections, both minor, both technical. They had also sent back a copy of their own pre-mission behavioral profile of the Vrethkai court, which was considerably shorter and contained an apologetic note explaining that their intelligence resources were newer and less comprehensive. Ambassador Vasquez read both documents over breakfast on the third morning and made her decision. She met with Sergeant Meta and Corporal Darko before the session. The 3 of them stood in the corridor outside the delegation quarters, where Meta had spoken with the chronicler the previous day. I'm going to propose a modification to our security posture for today's session, Vasquez said. I want you both to have chairs at the table. Not behind me. At the table. Darko glanced at Meta. A micro-expression the ambassador had learned, over 2 years working with these two, to read as processing. That changes the protection profile significantly, Meta said. If something goes wrong, we're out of position. I know. I'm making a calculated decision that nothing will go wrong, and that being out of position will demonstrate something to our hosts that being in position does not. The ambassador folded her hands. They've been watching us watch them for 3 days. They've been reading our doctrine. They know exactly what we're capable of, and they shared that assessment with us, which means they want us to know that they know. She paused. I want to show them that we're capable of extending trust before they've formally earned it, because that's what we're asking them to do with us. Meta was quiet for a moment. The doctrine doesn't cover this scenario specifically. I know, Vasquez said. That's why I'm asking rather than ordering. You two are the ones taking the risk. Another glance between the guards. This one the ambassador read as something different. A kind of consultation that didn't require words because the people conducting it had spent enough time together that words were redundant. We're in, Darko said. When the humans entered the chamber for the third session, the court noticed immediately that the security configuration had changed. The 2 guards accompanied the ambassador to the negotiating table and sat, with the composed attentiveness that the court had come to recognize as their default state, on either side of her. Not behind. Not at the periphery. At the table. The court reacted, not dramatically, not with alarm, but with the small collective recalibration of beings whose model of a situation has just been revised. Several delegates leaned together in quiet conference. The Vrethkai chief negotiator looked at Queen Sarathuval with an expression that asked a question. The queen answered with a slight movement of her crest that the court read as, *wait. Watch, *. Ambassador Vasquez opened the session with a prepared statement. It was not long, 8 minutes, which in diplomatic context was brief to the point of being almost informal. She outlined Earth's position on the territorial question with precision and without rhetorical ornament. She acknowledged the Dominion's legitimate interests in the Kepler corridor transit lanes. She proposed a framework for shared use that preserved Earth's established colonial operations while providing the Dominion with access rights that their commercial fleet expansion required. It was, the Vrethkai negotiators would note in their own debriefs, a serious proposal. Not a maximalist opening bid designed to be bargained down, a genuine framework built on a realistic assessment of both parties' needs and constraints. It had clearly been constructed by people who had done their homework. The ambassador then said something that was not in the prepared statement. Your Grace and honored delegates, I want to acknowledge something directly. We are a young species at this table. We have been in space by your historical standards for a moment. We have made mistakes in that time, diplomatic mistakes, strategic mistakes, and some failures of judgment we are still working to understand. I am not here to ask you to treat us as equals in experience or in institutional knowledge. I am here to ask you to treat us as a species that is trying to be honest about what it is and what it wants, and to evaluate us on that basis. She paused. My security personnel are sitting at this table today instead of standing at the walls. That is an unusual decision that I made this morning, and I made it because I wanted to show you something that is harder to show in a formal security configuration, that we are capable of extending trust before it has been formally negotiated. We are asking you to do the same thing with us. It seemed right to demonstrate it first. The chamber was quiet. Queen Sarathuval looked at Sergeant Meta. Meta was looking at the ambassador with the same composed attention she gave everything, not emotional, not performative, simply present. Then the Queen looked at Corporal Darko. He was watching the room. He was always watching the room. The Queen leaned forward slightly and said, addressing Ambassador Vasquez directly, a breach of the formal protocol that required initial exchanges through the chief negotiator, Ambassador. The framework you have proposed requires 3 days of technical review by our legal staff. I am prepared to authorize that review. In the meantime, I would like to invite your delegation, including your security personnel, to an informal dinner this evening. Not a ceremonial event. An actual dinner. I want to understand your species better before we sign anything. Ambassador Vasquez looked briefly at Meta. Meta gave a small nod, the most minimal possible version of yes, this is fine, I will assess the security implications and adapt. We would be honored, Your Grace, the ambassador said. That evening, for the first time in the recorded history of the Vrethkai Grand Court, a human soldier sat at the Queen's private dining table and was asked, over the course of 3 hours, everything the Queen had ever wanted to know about what it meant to be a species that had decided to be honest about itself. Corporal Darko, it turned out, was a quietly thoughtful man who had grown up in a fishing village in Ghana and had read more history than most academics. He answered every question the Queen asked with the same measured precision he brought to everything else. The Queen found, to her considerable interest, that she liked him. On the 5th day the Dominion received news that complicated everything. A Threlian patrol fleet, not affiliated with the Threlian diplomatic delegation present at the court, but operating under orders from a separate Threlian military command structure that the delegation either could not control or was not informing anyone about, had entered the outer boundary of the Kepler corridor and conducted what they officially termed a navigational survey of 2 human colonial installations. The survey had involved 12 warships. The colonists at both installations had been given 48 hours notice by automated Threlian military broadcast, which was technically compliance with Galactic Registry conflict prevention protocols, and had spent those 48 hours sending increasingly urgent communications to Earth. Earth had responded. Not with ships, not yet. With a message. The Vrethkai intelligence apparatus intercepted it, as they intercepted most interstellar communications in their region of space, and Vethoryuan brought the text to the Queen before the morning session. The message was from Earth's Consolidated Defense Command. It was addressed to the Threlian military fleet directly. It said in its entirety, Asterisk to Commander, Threlian Survey Fleet, Kepler Corridor. We have noted your presence and your stated intentions. Our colonial installations are civilian operations. We ask that your survey maintain the 200-kilometer exclusion boundary required under Galactic Registry Protocol 7, Article 14. We are documenting this interaction. We will respond to any protocol violation proportionally and without unnecessary escalation. We extend professional courtesy. Earth Consolidated Defense Command. Asterisk. Vethoryuan had highlighted 2 phrases when he brought it to the Queen. We are documenting this interaction, and proportionally and without unnecessary escalation. Explain your concern, the Queen said. Majesty, documenting this interaction, in military communications context is not an administrative statement. It is a specific signal. It means that whatever happens next will be entered into a formal record that Earth intends to reference. It is a statement of institutional memory, a declaration that this moment will be remembered and accounted for regardless of outcome. Vethoryuan set down his briefing notes. The second phrase is more significant. Proportionally and without unnecessary escalation, is the doctrine language of a military that has thought carefully about how conflicts begin and has decided that it will not be responsible for the first miscalculated step. It is patient language. It is the language of a military that is confident in its eventual position and therefore does not need to be aggressive in the present moment. The Queen considered this. How confident should they be in their eventual position? Vethoryuan took a breath. Majesty, our assessment of human military capability has been undergoing continuous revision for the past 5 days. I want to be precise about what we know and what we do not know. Be precise. What we know. Human colonial infrastructure in the Kepler corridor is more extensive than our pre-contact surveys suggested. Their construction methodology is efficient enough that installations we assessed as 2 years old are, based on revised analysis, closer to 6 months old. They build quickly and they build to last. Their communication encryption has resisted our standard decryption protocols at a rate that suggests their cryptographic methodology is significantly more sophisticated than their overall technological profile implied. And the patrol fleet they have in the corridor, the one we have been tracking for the past 3 months, is not their full capability. Based on shipyard activity we can observe at their colonial bases, it represents approximately 30% of their active defense capacity for this region. The Queen was quiet. What we do not know, Vethoryuan continued, is their full strategic doctrine for a sustained conflict. We do not know how their population responds to external military pressure, whether it produces political fracture or consolidation. And we do not know the location or status of what their public defense budgets indicate is a significant deep space reserve capacity that does not appear in any regional deployment record we have access to. Ships you cannot find, the Queen said. Ships we cannot find, Vethoryuan confirmed. In a species that publishes most of its doctrine openly, the absence of information about something is itself information. The morning session proceeded as scheduled. Ambassador Vasquez arrived with her security detail, Meta and Darko in their standard configuration, calm, attentive, doing their jobs. If she knew about the Threlian fleet movement, and Vethoryuan was certain she did, she gave no visible indication of concern. Queen Sarathuval, watching the ambassador settle into her seat across the negotiating table, made a decision. She addressed the ambassador before the session was formally opened, another protocol breach that her court was by now beginning to accept as a pattern. Ambassador Vasquez, we have received information about a Threlian military movement in your corridor. The ambassador nodded once. We are aware. How are you handling it? Pause. Not the pause of someone deciding what to say, the pause of someone choosing the most efficient way to say what they had already decided. We sent them a message, Vasquez said. We're waiting to see if they read it carefully. And if they do not? Then we'll respond proportionally, the ambassador said. As the message stated. The Queen studied her. You are not concerned. I'm concerned, Vasquez said. I'm not panicking. Those are different responses to the same information. She looked at the Queen evenly. Your Grace, my government sent 2 people to guard me in your court. Not as a provocation, not as a statement of disregard for security. Because 2 trained people, properly deployed and properly focused, are what this situation requires. We tend to try to match our response to the actual requirement rather than to what looks impressive. It takes some discipline. But it makes for better outcomes. The Queen looked at Meta and Darko who were, as always, doing their jobs. I have been thinking about your guards, the Queen said, since the first session. I know, Vasquez said. That was partially the point. The treaty technical review was completed that afternoon. The legal team had found it sound. The Threlian fleet did not read the message carefully. On the 6th day of the Vrethkai diplomatic session, the day the treaty was scheduled for final review and proposed signing, a Threlian patrol vessel crossed the 200-kilometer exclusion boundary around the human colonial installation designated Kepler 7c. It did so slowly, on a course that its navigation systems would later describe as a calibration drift. The colonists at Kepler 7c documented the incursion with their passive sensor array, as they had been told to do, and transmitted the record to Earth. 12 minutes later, a second Threlian vessel crossed the boundary at Kepler 7b. The Vrethkai intelligence apparatus tracked all of this in real time. Vethoryuan was in the Queen's private communication chamber by the time the second violation was confirmed, watching the data feed with the particular stillness of someone who is trying to determine the rate at which a complicated situation is becoming a crisis. The crisis answer arrived 47 minutes after the second incursion. 2 human vessels, not colony ships, not freighters, not the patrol craft the Vrethkai had been tracking, appeared on sensors at the edge of the Kepler corridor. They had not been there before. They had not transited through any observed jump point. They were simply present, as though they had always been there and the Vrethkai sensor network had simply not been looking at the right place. They were large. Not in the theatrical sense of warships designed to communicate power through scale, they were large in the functional sense of vessels built to carry significant capability over significant distances and to remain operational for extended periods without resupply. Their emission signature was consistent with military-grade power plants running at moderate output, not active weapon systems, not full combat readiness, but not civilian configuration either. They were sitting at the edge of the corridor the way a person sits in a doorway, present, visible, not threatening but impossible to ignore. Each vessel had sent a single communication to the Threlian fleet. The message was identical to the first one with one modification. The phrase, "We are documenting this interaction," had been removed. In its place was, "We note that 2 boundary violations have now occurred. Our response posture has been adjusted accordingly. We reiterate our preference for proportional resolution and our commitment to not escalating beyond what the situation requires." The Threlian patrol vessels withdrew to the boundary line within 20 minutes. Vethoryuan brought all of this to the Queen's chambers in a written summary, because the morning session was already underway and interrupting it directly seemed, on balance, inadvisable. He noted 3 things in the summary's conclusion. First, that the human vessels had appeared from a location consistent with a deep space staging position that Earth's published defense budgets implied existed but that the Vrethkai had been unable to locate. Second, that Earth's response latency from second boundary violation to visible military presence was 47 minutes, which was substantially faster than the physics of the situation appeared to allow unless the vessels had been positioned with foreknowledge of the Threlian fleet's intentions. And third, that at no point had Earth's response escalated beyond what was proportional to the actual incursion. The third point was, Vethoryuan wrote, the most operationally significant finding. Human military doctrine, as demonstrated in this incident, appears to be calibrated to resolve situations at the lowest effective level of response while demonstrating the capacity for higher levels. The message this sends to a potential adversary is precise. We will not overreact, but we have already accounted for the scenario in which you choose to escalate, and we are prepared for it. This is not a posture of weakness. It is the posture of a military that is confident enough in its ultimate position that it does not need to prove anything in the present moment. In the morning session, Ambassador Vasquez received a secure communication from Earth Consolidated Defense Command. She read it on a small device under the edge of the table, a gesture that the court noticed but that she made no attempt to conceal. After reading it, she set the device down, folded her hands, and continued participating in the treaty discussion with complete attentiveness. Corporal Darko had noticed the communication arrive. He gave no outward indication. He watched the room. During a recess in the session, Queen Sarathuval approached the ambassador privately. "The Threlian matter," the Queen said, "is resolved for the moment," Vasquez said. "They've pulled back. We'll need to address the boundary protocol violation through the Galactic registry process, but that's administrative. Your vessels appeared very quickly. We had reason to think the situation might develop in that direction. You prepositioned. We planned," the ambassador said. "There's a difference. Planning assumes possible outcomes and prepares for them. It doesn't predetermine what will happen. The Threlian fleet may have decided not to test the boundary. We would have been equally prepared for that." She paused. "We don't hope for outcomes, Your Grace. We prepare for a range of them and adapt to whichever one arrives. It's actually less stressful that way. Fewer surprises." The Queen thought about Corporal Darko's heart rate on the first day. 8%. A being who had already processed the possibility of threat before it arrived, and therefore experienced its arrival as confirmation rather than shock. "You apply this at every scale," the Queen said. It was not a question. "We try to," the ambassador said. "We don't always succeed. But we try." The Queen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would like to add a mutual defense clause to the treaty framework." Ambassador Vasquez looked at her carefully. "That's a significant change from the original framework." "Yes. May I ask what prompted it?" The Queen considered several diplomatic formulations and then, in the spirit of the past 6 days, discarded all of them. "I have been watching your people for 6 days," she said. "And I have concluded that a species which responds to provocation with precision rather than panic, which publishes its methods because it believes honesty produces better outcomes, and which sends 2 guards where others send 40, that is a species I would prefer to have as a partner when the situations arrive that none of us have planned for." Ambassador Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would need to consult with Earth before accepting any framework modification. Earth's response when it came took 4 hours. It consisted of 2 words: proceed carefully. The ambassador interpreted this as yes. The treaty was signed on the 8th day. It was not a simple document. Over 7 days of negotiation, what had begun as a bilateral agreement about transit rights in a single stellar corridor had expanded, carefully with legal review at every stage, into a framework covering commercial access, communication protocols, mutual non-aggression commitments, scientific exchange parameters, and the mutual defense clause that Queen Sarathuval had proposed and Ambassador Vasquez's government had, after 4 hours of deliberation, accepted. The signing ceremony was, by the standards of Vrethkai diplomatic tradition, unusually informal. This had been, quietly, the ambassador's suggestion, not because she wanted to diminish the significance of the moment, but because she had observed over 8 days that the formal ceremony structures of the Vrethkai court were calibrated to communicate hierarchy rather than partnership. She wanted the ceremony to communicate something different. Queen Sarathuval, who had spent 8 days re-evaluating models she had held for decades, agreed. The signatories sat across a table, not at opposite ends of a formal chamber. There were witnesses from both delegations and from the neutral observer corps. There was no processional. There was no dominance display. The documents were reviewed, confirmed, and signed by both parties in sequence, and the witness corps notarized the record. Afterward, the court held a reception that was considerably more relaxed than any event the Grand Chronicler could recall in recent institutional memory. Delegates from 43 species circulated through the chamber with food and quiet conversation, and the humans moved among them with the same attentive composure they brought to everything. Present, engaged, doing their jobs, which at a reception were the jobs of representing their species honestly and listening carefully to what other species said. Corporal Darko was approached, during the reception, by the Mukai cultural attaché, who had been watching him with evident fascination since the first session. "May I ask you something?" the Mukai asked. The species was small and somewhat luminescent. Their question conveyed through a translator bead that softened their native ultrasonic communication into standard. "Sure," Darko said. "You were close to the Queen on the first day, when she performed the proximity display. Our observers recorded that your stress indicators remained very close to baseline. Were you not afraid?" Darko considered this with the unhurried seriousness he gave most questions. "I was aware that the situation could become dangerous," he said. "I'd assessed it. I knew where the exits were, where Sergeant Meta was, what my options were if things went wrong. I'd already done that work before I walked in." Pause. "Once you've done that work, you don't need to keep doing it in the moment. The moment is just the moment." "But she could have harmed you." "Probably," Darko said. "She also chose not to. Most beings choose not to, when they're given a reasonable alternative." He looked across the room to where Ambassador Vasquez was speaking with the Vrethkai chief negotiator. That's what the ambassador was trying to give her. A reasonable alternative to deciding we were a threat. The Mukai attaché was quiet for a moment. "Your species is very strange." "We get that," Darko said. Queen Sarathuval, who had been close enough to hear this exchange, chose that moment to join the conversation. She did so without ceremony, stepping into the small group with the directness that her court had learned to recognize as her preferred mode when she was genuinely interested in something. "I want to ask you something directly, Corporal," she said. "And I want the honest answer, not the diplomatic one." Darko looked at her with the same level attention he gave everything. "Your Grace. When I approached you on the first day, when I was performing the proximity assessment, what were you thinking?" Pause. Not the pause of evasion. The pause of precision. "I was thinking," Darko said, "that you were the most impressive thing I'd ever been in a room with. And I was thinking that my job was to stay at my post." Those two thoughts did not conflict? "No," he said. "The first thought was just information. The second one was a decision I'd already made." The Queen looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked around the room, at the reception, at the delegates from 43 species, at Ambassador Vasquez, at Sergeant Meta standing near the door doing exactly what she always did, and she thought about the past 8 days. She had come into this engagement expecting to assess a new species and communicate, gently and without cruelty, the realities of the galactic stage. She had expected to find a young and probably anxious civilization navigating unfamiliar waters with the mixed results that usually characterized first contact. She had found something else. She had found a species that had thought carefully, over a long time and at considerable cost, about what it meant to be present in a dangerous universe without becoming a danger itself. That had concluded, after all that thinking, that honesty was strategically sound. That transparency, properly practiced, was a kind of strength. That the most reliable signal of confidence was not the size of the force you deployed but the precision with which you matched it to the actual requirement. And that had trained its soldiers to hold a line, not through insensitivity, not through recklessness, but through the particular discipline of beings who had already made their decision before the moment arrived. She thought about Darko's 8% heart rate. About Meta's 14 status transmissions. About the 2 warships that had appeared at the edge of the Kepler corridor, visible and present and doing nothing more than was necessary. She thought about a species that published its methods because it believed the universe worked better when everyone understood the rules. She thought about the treaty on the table, signed, witnessed, and now part of the permanent record of both their civilizations. "Corporal," she said. "Your Grace. You are going to be an interesting species to know." Darko considered this with the same measured seriousness he brought to everything else. Then, for the first time in 8 days of observation, the Grand Chronicler noted a micro-expression that its long experience classified, with some surprise, as genuine warmth. "We try," he said. The treaty between Earth and the Vrethkai Dominion remained in force for 93 years without a significant violation. Historians later noted that this was, by the standards of interstellar agreements of comparable scope, an unusually long record of compliance. They attributed it to several factors: the careful drafting, the aligned commercial interests, the competence of the diplomatic teams on both sides. Queen Sarathuval, who lived long enough to see the treaty's 50th anniversary celebrated in the Grand Court where it had been signed, had a different theory. She thought it had something to do with the kind of being you chose to send to represent you, and what it told the other party about who you actually were. She kept, in her private study, a photograph. A human artifact, printed on a material their species favored for permanent records. It showed Corporal Darko at his post on the first day, taken by the court's passive monitoring system, standing at the eastern archway, still, composed, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. He had not known it was being taken. He looked exactly like what he was, a person doing his job in a room full of beings who had the power to end him, because he had already decided that this was what he was here to do. She thought it was one of the most honest portraits of a species she had ever seen. She kept it because she thought it was important to remember what honesty looked like when it walked into a room.